much, Dorothy. Aren't we lucky to have a beautiful room like this at your library?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so in advance, I'm going to apologize that we're going to, at the end, turn on a video and hopefully it will work out fine. So I'm Mayumi Tsutakawa, and someone was asking me how long I've lived in Seattle. Oh my goodness. I think about, well, I don't want to say how old I am, but since I was 5, at my particular address in Mount Baker, but actually my dad was born in Seattle. So we're a pioneer family. That was 1910. So Humanities Washington likes for you to think and answer the questions. And so we always pose a couple of questions that by the end we hope that you'll think about, and maybe we'll have a discussion. But you know, if you don't want to talk about those things, we can talk about other things. But the questions that I like to pose in this discussion about the early roots of feminism in the Pacific Northwest are: what defined feminism 100 years ago as compared to today? And how does your cultural heritage affect your definition of feminism? So those are the questions that we're going to think about. I want to very much thank the Southwest Seattle Historical Society and also Humanities Washington. And please remember that this program is supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, a federal agency which is supported by a congressional appropriation which has been cut down by the leader of our country. So please let all of your representatives in Congress know that the National Endowment for the Humanities is very important. So first of all, I want to acknowledge that we are settled here on Duwamish tribal land that was part of a Native American legacy dating back 11,000 years in the Pacific Northwest. So let's always remember that. And today I will present to you stories of women in arts and journalism in Washington, pioneers, pathfinders, and breakers of stereotypes. And I'd like to focus on the 1920s and 30s, the pre-war period, as a formative time for the communities of the Pacific Northwest. And I want to encourage a comparison of the political forces affecting women while sharing stories between cultural communities and recognition of women's lives across generations as well. In the humanities, we use historical records to study people's lives and accomplishments. The influences on these women's lives were many: the arc of history, world wars, control by patriarchal institutions, the church and the state, the family structure, conflicting points of view of foreign-born parents and their American-born offspring. And these resulted in controls on the right to vote, on the right to work outside of the home, to marry whom one wanted to divorce and remarry, or to not marry at all. 100 years ago, it was daring and even dangerous for women to speak out, to publish their writing and their photographs, to examine gender discrimination, and to work outside the home for their own income. Okay, here's a picture that our friends in the front row will recognize. I think you probably know some people there. So why me? Women's history has been one of my passions through activism, writing, and creating art exhibitions. Since the 1970s, I have presented the history of women of color and women in the arts to my community and to the public. I began my activist career within the progressive movement in Seattle and helped to organize a study group called Seattle Third World Women. I was in many activist protests in the International District, at the UW. As Asian Student Coalition president, I spoke out against the bombing of Cambodia. And I recently went to Cambodia for the first time, just a couple months ago. It was It was very heartbreaking, but also inspiring to go there. And later, I should tell you, can you guess who I am? And right here I am, along with Selmy Domingo. I think Roberto Maestas is in there too. Okay. Later, as a writer for the Seattle Times, I covered the early feminist movement in Washington State and was the primary reporter covering the Washington Women's Conference. I know some of you remember that. And the National Women's Conference in 1977. This was really a big deal at the time. Remember the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment? It still hasn't passed after all that time. And I also co-edited 2 anthologies of women of color writings, which she's already mentioned. Suffrage. The word suffrage comes from the ancient Latin word suffragium, or a petitioner's prayer on behalf of others. The right to vote, called women's suffrage, was new to many parts of the United States when the federal government passed the constitutional amendment granting women the right to vote in 1920. And we're about to celebrate the centenary of that act this coming year in 2020. But in Washington State, the all-male legislature voted to give women suffrage first in 1883 and then again in 1888. Imagine, this was only 20 years after Seattle was incorporated as a small town of 1,000 people. Then legal maneuvering set the vote aside, and finally, by a popular statewide vote, the state constitution was amended to give Washington women the right to vote in 1910. That's 10 years before 1920. Note that black males were given the right to vote in 2 U.S. constitutional amendments in 1868 and 1870. And Native Americans got the right to vote in 1887 if they forswore their tribal affiliation. That rule ended in 1924, and all Native Americans got the right to vote regardless of their tribal affiliation. And thus Washington became the 5th state in the entire nation to provide the right to vote to women. And what were the previous 4? We were the 5th one. What were the previous 4? They were not the states with huge urban centers like New York, California, or Illinois. They were Colorado, Idaho, Utah, and Wyoming. And then Washington became the 5th. Why? We'll discuss that later. Why? They wanted their women to vote. Why? And every step along the way, there were political battles inspired by national women's suffrage speakers like Susan B. Anthony, who spoke here in Washington in 1871, with committees of women, with hearings, lobbying, leaflets, and marches. And these are all the same things that we do today to create political change. What is feminism? The notion of feminism is the key building block in raising women to achieve these steps of change, like the right to vote. Feminism is a whole range of political movements, ideologies, and social movements that share a common goal. And that goal is to define and achieve political, economic, and personal equality of the sexes. This includes seeking to establish educational and professional opportunities for women that are equal to those of men. Feminist movements have campaigned and continue to campaign for women's rights, including, as we said, the right to vote, to hold public office, to work certain types of jobs, to get fair wages or equal pay, to own property, to receive an education, to enter into contracts, to have equal rights within marriage and to have maternity leave. Feminists have also worked to ensure access to legal abortion and to protect women and girls from rape, sexual harassment, and domestic violence. Changes in dress and acceptable physical activities, such as sports, have often been part of women's movements as well. Today I'd like to present to you the lives of diverse women who are pioneers in our state in that pre-war period of 100 years ago. And then we'll discuss and see whether you think that their interesting lives and achievements amount to feminist acts. As was also previously announced, they are Imogene Cunningham, Priscilla Chong-Ju, Vi Hilbert, Anna Louise Strong, and Ruby Bishop. Imogene Cunningham was a celebrated photographer, and she was born in Portland in 1883 as the fifth of 10 children. She grew up in Seattle, and in 1901, at the age of 18, Cunningham bought her first camera, a 4x5-inch view camera. She entered the University of Washington, which had been founded only 40 years before, and with the help of her chemistry professor, she began to study the chemistry behind photography, and she subsidized her tuition by photographing plants for the botany department. In 1907, Cunningham graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in chemistry. And after graduation, she went to work for the famous photographer Edward S. Curtis in his Seattle studio, learning the portrait business and also practical photography. She worked on the Edward S. Curtis project of documenting American Indian tribes for his famous set of books, The North American Indian, which was published between 1907 and 1930. Cunningham learned the technique of platinum printing under Curtis's supervision and became fascinated by that process. In 1909, Cunningham was awarded a graduate fellowship to study at the Technische Hochschule in Dresden, Germany, where she helped the photographic chemistry department to find cheaper solutions for the expensive platinum used for printing. At the age of only 27, Cunningham opened her own photo studio in Seattle and won acclaim for her portraits. We'll see on the next slide. Most of her portrait work consisted of sitters in their own homes, in her living room, or in the woods surrounding Cunningham's cottage, which I believe was next to the Arboretum in Seattle. She became a sought-after photographer and exhibited at the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences in 1913. The next year, she married Roy Partridge, a teacher and an artist, and between 1915 and 1920, Cunningham continued her work and had 3 children. In 1920, the family moved to San Francisco. Oh, here's a portrait, a very artistic portrait. She refined her style, taking a greater interest in patterns and detail, and thus increasingly interested in people as well as botanical photography, especially flowers. Cunningham again changed directions, becoming more interested in the human form, but in particular hands. And she was fascinated with the hands of artists and musicians. This interest led to her employment by Vanity Fair magazine, photographing movie stars without their makeup. Now, this was a big thing then. I like to think it's a big thing now. And in 1934, Cunningham was invited to work in New York for Vanity Fair magazines, 1934. Her husband wanted her to wait until he could travel with her, but she refused and they divorced. In 1945, Cunningham was invited by Ansel Adams to accept a position on the faculty of the San Francisco Art Institute. And in the 1950s and 60s, She continued her nature photography work with other leading photographers, such as Edward Weston, who photographed the Yosemite National Park. You probably know that. And Cunningham died in 1976 at the age of 93, just after her work was exhibited at a major photography festival in France. Her archives are stored by her granddaughter, who lives on Lopez Island. And I have seen that. It is beautiful to see her work, the original work. Photo by Dean Wong. Priscilla Chong-Ju was a fiber artist and a gallery shop owner. Priscilla Wong, as her name was then, was born in 1916 on the Kitsap Peninsula in the town of Fragaria. Anybody know Fragaria? Fragaria is actually the Latin name for strawberry. She loved to explain that. Her parents had no idea of English names, and so their older daughter asked her school teacher for a name, and thus came Priscilla. This is Priscilla and her 3 sisters on the Kitsap Peninsula on a horse. Her father was a Baptist minister from the Guangdong region of southern China and a very early Chinese convert to the Baptist faith. The family came to Seattle in 1909, right at the time of the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition, a very large, fancily constructed international fair on the UW campus after they moved to the Montlake area. Priscilla's mother, the daughter of a dry goods shop owner in China, was quite the entrepreneur. And seeing all these potential customers at the exposition, she decided to open a shop in downtown Seattle, bringing over embroidered clothing and gift items from China. By 1931, the family opened another shop with Chinese goods as part of the Western Washington Fair in Puyallup, and Priscilla ran that by herself for 30 years, from the time she was a teenager. The family also managed a Chinese gift shop as part of the Seattle World's Fair in 1962. Some of you may have been there. She says her mother did not speak much English, but was great with customers, good-tempered, and hardworking. But during the Depression, the family ate a lot of sautéed peanuts and lettuce over rice. We could buy 5 heads of lettuce for a dime at the end of the day, she said. But after that, I could never eat cooked lettuce again. Priscilla married the noted Chinese artist Fei Chong, who helped to organize exhibitions of the Chinese Painters Club in Seattle's International District. She developed fabric designs and exhibited and sold them. Her textile designs included block prints, tie-dye, weaving, and batik, and I believe that that must be tie-dye. She exhibited her work at the early Bellevue Arts and Crafts Fair with her husband Fei for 23 years. The couple had 3 children, and after Fei Chong died suddenly at the age of 61, Priscilla married Willard Ju, a noted Chinese community historian and herbalist. Unfortunately, he died after only 2.5 years of marriage in 1984. Even into her 80s, Priscilla Chong-Ju's interests included her artwork, designing and constructing parade floats and costumes for the University District Fair and Parade, ice skating, and Hawaiian dance. She died in 2012 at the age of 96, so ice skating and Hawaiian dance. That's what you need to do. Vi Hilbert. Vi Hilbert was a Native American language preservationist. She was born Vi Anderson, a member of the Upper Skagit tribe, in 1918 near the small town of Lyman in Skagit County, up towards Bellingham. Her father was a master canoe maker and a champion canoe racer. He and her mother spoke the Lushootseed, Puget Salish language, and this is the language of Chief Sealth, who founded Seattle. And as the family moved from one small town to another, often as fruit pickers, her mother coaxed stories out of the native people, and Vi learned and treasured all these stories. After attending so many schools because they moved around, she opted to enroll in the Indian boarding school in Salem, Oregon, and then finished high school there. She eventually married 3 times and had 3 children, 2 of whom now survive. Her many jobs in Washington included berry picking, ironing, housework, running a pool hall, processing pears in a cannery, a stock clerk, a cookie wrapper for a Danish bakery, an electric welder at Todd Shipyards, cashiering for a food truck at Boeing, a secretary at Children's Orthopedic Hospital, and a hairdresser. The things people had to do. The language. In 1967, she met and agreed to help the linguist Thomas Hess transcribe and translate the early Lushootseed recordings of elders. They had never been translated and transcribed before. She learned to read and write this language, which she had only learned as an oral language, and she eventually taught the Lushootseed language and traditional stories at the University of Washington. The UW Press published 3 of her books. Then she established her own printing house, the Lushootseed Press, to continue publication of her many volumes of native language books, such as stories and dictionaries. Vi Hilbert taught for 15 years at the University of Washington and 3 more years at Evergreen College, and many of her students became Lushootseed teachers. She shared her native traditions in institutions with institutions such as the Burke Museum, the Seattle Art Museum, and United Indians of All Tribes. She received many awards, including one from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Vi Hilbert often spoke Lushootseed with every audience that she addressed, especially traditional gatherings, so that this ancient language can be heard throughout Puget Sound, where it has been spoken for centuries. Vi Hilbert passed away at her home in La Conner in 2008 at the age of 90. Okay, so we're going to see that activism is good for longevity. Anna Louise Strong. Anna Louise Strong is one of the most notable radical women journalists in the history of the United States. She was born in Nebraska in 1885, the daughter of middle-class liberals who were active in missionary work and the Congregational Church. A gifted child, she raced through public school, then studied languages in Europe. She graduated from Bryn Mawr College, did graduate work at Oberlin, and at the age of 23 earned her PhD from the University of Chicago. As an advocate for child welfare for the United States Education Office, she organized an exhibit about child welfare and toured it extensively throughout the United States and abroad. When she brought it to Seattle for 6 months, starting in May 1914, it attracted more than 6,000 people a day, many of them women, and culminating with an audience of 40,000 on the last day. So people were hungry for this information about the welfare of poor children. Unable to find solutions for the needs of children and the working class, Strong concluded that capitalism was at fault and became an avowed socialist. She was 30 years old when she returned to Seattle to live with her father, the Reverend Sidney Strong, pastor of the Queen Anne Congregational Church. She favored the Seattle political climate at the time, which was pro-labor and progressive. She also enjoyed mountain climbing and led climbing parties on Mount Rainier. When Strong ran for the Seattle School Board in 1916, she won easily, thanks to the support of women's groups and organized labor. and her reputation as an expert on child welfare. She was the only female school board member. She argued that the schools should offer social service programs for underprivileged children and that they should serve as community centers. But other school board members did not agree with her. In the year of her election, 1916, the Everett Massacre occurred, and Strong was hired as a stringer by the New York Evening Post to report on the bloody conflict between the International Workers of the World Union, which we call the Wobblies, and the army of armed guards hired by Everett mill owners to keep them out of town. At first an impartial observer, she soon became an impassioned spokesperson for workers' rights. Strong's endorsement of controversial liberal causes set her apart from colleagues on the school board. She opposed war as a pacifist, and when the United States entered into World War I in 1917, she spoke out against the draft. On the one hand, the PTA and women's clubs joined her in opposing military training in our public schools. On the other hand, groups of military veterans branded her as unpatriotic. Strong's fellow school board members were quick to launch a recall campaign against her, and they won by a narrow margin. She became more openly associated with the liberal press, writing forceful pro-labor articles and promoting the new Soviet government. In 1919, 2 days before the beginning of the Seattle General Strike, she proclaimed her support for the strike, which shut down the city for 4 days and then ended peacefully. Disillusioned with the indecision of this labor movement, Strong began to travel as a foreign correspondent for radical American newspapers. I just recently found this picture. This is Anna Louise Strong with Chairman Mao and W.E.B. Du Bois in China. In the late 1920s and into the early 30s, Strong ventured into China, parts of Asia, and throughout the Soviet Union, interviewing ordinary workers and people in the street, as well as senior Soviet leaders. She visited Spain in 1937 during the Spanish Civil War and accompanied the Soviet Red Army into Poland and Berlin as they were victorious in 1945. And she visited China during the latter stages of the War of Liberation in 1949 with Chairman Mao. After World War II, Strong was arrested in the US for espionage. She was freed, and after another visit to the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, some of us don't remember, in 1955, she settled in China in 1958 at the age of 72, where she was one of the few Western journalists to gain the admiration and audience of Chairman Mao Zedong. Here's a photo of her with Chairman Mao and Chinese revolutionary leaders and the African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois in 1959. And she died in China in 1970 at the age of 85, having written more than 30 books based on her journalistic work. Okay, here's where we're going to play the video. You're just going to help me. Okay, take a break.
Do a little more, can you pick it up?
Yes. Yeah. Sound?
Local jazz legend Ruby Bishop. My guest is Ruby Bishop, one of the jazz treasures of the Northwest.
From KCTS, which I borrowed film. Thank you. Oh, so is it gonna
I
run
think it
if
should, I
just-
think it should still,
No, it's not on. We have to go back to it. Oh, yeah, that would work. Okay, okay, so it's gonna work? If not, I'll call you. Ruby was in her early 90s in this video. She had a great tone. So Ruby Bishop, the legendary jazz singer and pianist, was born Ruby Carol Cogwell in 1919 in the town of Rochester in Thurston County. That's near Olympia. In Thurston County, among other Black pioneer families. She was the 8th child and worked on the family farm. Dancing for country fairs at the age of 5 and mostly self-taught on the piano, she led the Centralia Buccaneers band at the age of 12. After graduating from high school, her parents sent her to the University of Washington, where they hoped that she would be trained as a pharmacist. Within a year, she left the university to start her music career. Settling in Seattle in the 1930s, Bishop played solo gigs at many of Seattle's well-known jazz venues. And one of her big influences was the piano player Fats Waller, who invented the stride piano. So this song is done in the stride style, a kind of ragtime style. And because of restrictions imposed by the White Musicians Union, Black performers were limited to the south part of town, south of Jackson Street. This restricted area was where touring jazz greats could stay, perform, and hang out. Over the years, Bishop befriended and hosted many of these performers who looked forward to both her music and a home-cooked meal. And these greats included Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, and especially Louis Armstrong, whom she often escorted about town when he played in Seattle. Although she didn't become a pharmacist, she married a druggist, Alex Bishop, in the International District. And during World War II, like many women of her era, she became a Boeing B-17 mechanic and draftsman. After the war, she learned stenotyping. You know what that means, right? Stenotyping is abbreviated English. In preparation for becoming a court reporter. And then she studied to be a beautician. She held many jobs to support the family. However, she always looked to her nighttime music career as her main profession. Over time, others recognized her musical ability. By the time she was nearly in her 50s, Bishop had achieved enough prominence to be recruited by the U.S. Army to entertain GI troops stationed in South Korea and South Vietnam. By this point, she had also performed before audiences in London, Paris, and Stockholm. Despite that success, Bishop viewed Seattle as her home. And by the mid-1970s, both national and international travel became less frequent. After her first husband died, Ruby Bishop married a second time at the age of 82. I'm not sure how many children she had, but I know that she has 8 grandchildren. And after that husband died, she returned to performing regularly at Vito's Lounge on Madison, earning a spot in the Seattle Jazz Hall of Fame in 2016. She was 99 years old this year, and she died just a few months ago, living in the Mount Baker neighborhood, just a couple blocks away from me. Okay, so that was Ruby Bishop. I hope it. Oh, go back to the other version.
It used the arrow keys.
Oh, okay. All right. So, here's our questions again. What does it mean to be a feminist, or what did it mean to be a feminist 100 years ago and now? And what barriers for women still exist? It is impossible to decide on a single definition of feminism because a woman's struggle to find a place in the world is rooted in and reflective of her own experience. Has contemporary American feminism primarily come to mean championing women's personal autonomy and challenging the privilege of male over female? And what can feminism mean for women in different cultural communities? What are different priorities and different barriers? And what common goals can diverse women work on together? That is the end. Thank you very much.